Okay, colleagues, welcome to the second SERA session of Labour Conference 2022. And I think never before have I been asked to chair something in such a timely, such a vital time. You know, when you have the Royal Society of Protection of Birds referencing the government's attack on nature, and you actually realise that everything that we stood and understood in terms of regulation, the protection of our natural habitat, the protection of species is actually being put at risk. The huge importance of us drawing on the collective intelligence of the experts, local, national politicians, scientists, people who have been practicing this throughout has never been more important, because believe me, when we leave this conference this week, we have to start the fight back, because this is not just a war on nature, it's actually a war on all of our well-being. So I'm really, really pleased that we have such a diverse panel. And what I would like to do is to start the session off really with Dr. Simon Dowell from Chester Zoo, who are also great sponsors for this event, to really frame today's debate, and then I'm going to work along the panel introducing my colleagues where we can actually take a bit of their perspective. Simon.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And first of all, can I just say how delighted we are to be sponsoring this event this evening, because as Lisa was saying, you know, it is a really critical time for biodiversity. And in the last few days, we've heard some rather worrying announcements about some of the regulations and so on, which I will actually refer to later on. And of course, some of my colleagues in organisations like RSPB, Wildlife Trusts, have come out very strongly against what's being announced. So I'll come to some of that in a moment. Just to say a few words about myself, first of all. So my name is Dr. Simon Dowell. I'm the Conservation Science and Policy Director at Chester Zoo. I've had the great fortune and privilege of doing that job since 2016. Prior to that, I had an academic career. In fact, I spent many years working here in Liverpool at Liverpool John Moores University, first of all teaching and researching, and then more in a more senior position. And then I moved to Oxford Brookes University to a senior role in the university there. But I was also a trustee at Chester Zoo for about 6 years. So I've had a long association with the zoo and its conservation work. Now, the title of this evening's event is called Biodiversity Code Red, How to Reverse the Ecological Crisis. Well, biodiversity is being lost and nature is being degraded faster now than at any other point in human history. Research by the principal scientific advisory body to the United Nations on nature has stated that 1 million species are now at imminent risk of extinction. So what that means is that in our lifetimes and those of our children, we stand to lose iconic animals like elephants and tigers, orangutans, and familiar birds like curlews and puffins, as well as an absolute plethora of invertebrates and plants that support the ecosystems and ecological services upon which we all depend. And here in the UK, we're actually in the bottom 10% globally for biodiversity, having already lost half of our species. And we're now one of the most biodiversity depleted countries on Earth. So to tackle this crisis, both nationally and globally, we need innovative solutions and a complete rethink of the way in which we value nature and our place within it. So where do zoos like Chester Zoo come into all of this? Well, UK zoos are conservation powerhouses, and we're at the forefront of nature recovery in the UK as well as internationally. And good zoos have professionally planned, science-led conservation at their core. And we're more relevant to the fight to prevent extinction now than ever before. We're in a unique position to provide a lifeline for the threatened species that are in our care, and to protect and restore wild habitats. And we can also foster deep and lasting connections with nature amongst the general public, and we're helping to inspire the next generation of conservationists. Chester Zoo, which is only about 20 miles away from here, is a leading conservation and education charity with a mission to prevent extinction, both here in the UK and across the world. And we work with over 100 partners in about 20 different countries to recover threatened wildlife and restore habitats. The zoo's reach and influence extends well beyond our site in Chester. We have a 10-year conservation master plan, and within that we've committed ourselves to reversing the decline of at least 200 highly threatened populations of plants and animals, to improving a total of 250,000 hectares of landscape for wildlife across the world in 6 different locations, and to empowering people, 10 million people, to live more sustainably for wildlife. That's through our campaigns, our education work, and the engagement with our visitors and regional communities. And we are already working on a number of nature-based solutions that benefit biodiversity and climate. For example, the critically endangered orangutans that we care for in the zoo, together with our long-standing field project in Borneo with our Malaysian partners, has enabled us to campaign against unsustainable palm oil production, which is devastating tropical rainforest in Southeast Asia, and promote more sustainable sources of palm oil, which is key to ending tropical forest deforestation. Now, our sustainable palm oil campaign has resulted in thousands of school children and their families changing their consumer choices to support sustainable palm oil. And that's now supported by an app, I was demonstrating it to a few people earlier, that you can use to scan barcodes when you're shopping in the supermarket and then shop responsibly in relation to sustainable palm oil. We've also persuaded major suppliers and retailers to switch their supply chains to sustainable palm oil. And we recently declared Chester as the world's first sustainable palm oil city, having persuaded more than 50 local businesses to follow our lead. And there'll be other sustainable palm oil communities announced very shortly across the country. And it's also helped, our work has helped to influence the introduction of a no deforestation standard with the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil internationally. And we've also been instrumental in helping to persuade the UK government within the make a commitment in its Environment Act 2021 for legislation that will require large companies to procure major commodities from deforestation-free sources. So we're very heavily involved in native species conservation as well on our own doorstep. We have created extensive new habitats on our own land, and we are now extending this to a nature recovery corridor that extends between Chester and Ellesmere Port, and it's funded by the government's Green Recovery Challenge Fund. And it's very community-based, so the habitats created are created and maintained by local community groups, and that helps bring access to nature for everybody. So with over 35 million visits to UK zoos every year and a track record in finding innovative solutions to the biodiversity crisis, the UK zoos have a significant voice when it comes to influencing and shaping the policies that will determine the future of biodiversity in our environment. Now, the government's 25-year environment plan and passing into legislation of the Environment Act in last year provided actually some cause for optimism. But in the last few days, as we mentioned at the beginning, we've learned about the proposed rewriting or ditching of some of the retained EU laws, including the Habitats Directive, and rumours of a U-turn on the environmental land management scheme, which has been devised to support farmers to enact nature-based solutions. Now, all of this will make it harder for the government to meet its own targets on climate and nature, and ensure that the UK makes a full contribution to meeting the targets of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, due to be agreed at the delayed Biodiversity COP in December. And all the good intentions contained within these treaties will come to nothing and will fail if we cannot persuade the government to change its mind. So we must hold the government to account and ensure that that does not happen. And that's much of what we're about at Chester Zoo. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. And yes, I think I never thought I'd be looking back on the days of Michael Gove in charge of something with fondness, but there you go, that's how bad it's getting. Okay, Alex, I think Alex is probably well known to many of us who've been in the sort of the climate activist field and energy field for a number of years. He has been a leader amongst us from his time as a local councillor through to now his position on our shadow front bench. So very much welcome Alex Sobel, the Shadow Minister for Nature, Water and Flooding.
Thanks, Lisa. Shadow Minister for Nature, Water and Flooding is a very accurate description of my role. I'm also the chair of the all-party group on net zero. Prior to being on the front bench, I was a member of the Environmental Audit Committee, dealing with a lot of these issues on what is, I have to say, and I think people in the sector, I know there's a lot of people in the sector sat here, will all acknowledge an absolutely brilliant organisation in terms of holding the government to account and the reports it produces. And I see people in this room who've been in front of that committee when I was on it as well. And I'm also the chair of the SERA parliamentary group. So it's great to be here, and really again to thank Chester Zoo for their sponsorship of this event. And when Simon was talking about palm oil, it reminded me of a book launch I went to. People probably who know me probably knows I do a lot of work around advocacy for West Papua, and I went to a book launch by a woman called Sophie Chow, who'd lived 4 years in a village where effectively the indigenous trees have been ripped out and palm oil plantations have been planted. And the people in this village would dream of the oil palms weeping black, and their water, their air, their whole environment was choked by this palm oil. So I really want to thank Chester Zoo for their leadership on this issue, because, I mean, you know, probably everybody in this room loves trees, but oil palms are not really trees in the way that we traditionally think of them, and only should not be planted in sort of plantation form. There are very clear alternatives to palm oil, which we should be using. Anyway, that's a slight segue from my speech. When I wrote this speech, I was already sceptical of government's promises to reverse the nature crisis. I was going to tell you that I did not believe the ambition to halt the decline of species abundance in the UK by 2030 is good enough, and it isn't. I was going to tell you that targets are undermined by the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, which they are. I was going to say how ignoring 70% of land for nature restoration was letting big landowners off the hook, which it is, and talking about how these areas need to support our biodiversity, this other 70%, which they do. But what happened on Friday means my original points are almost insignificant. What happened on Friday was a full attack on nature. And these are not my words, these are the words of the RSPB. First, we had the budget, new investment zones and liberalised planning rules. And then there was the bill, the bonfire of regulations, which means the government are going to rip up hundreds of laws that have the origin in the EU. And as was reported, and as Simon said, the habitats regulations look like they're part of that, although we obviously haven't had official confirmation. Make no mistake, this is catastrophic for our natural environment. The UK is already the lowest 10% globally for biodiversity. The government is determined to accelerate a race to the bottom of that league table. We should be aiming for a dramatic incline in species abundance, not abandoning environmental protections and ripping up the habitat regulations. Make no mistake, the Tories have abandoned their promises to us and to nature. Only Labour can fix the natural environment. We have pledged a net zero and nature positive test for all government spending, which we're going to stick to. We'll invest £28 billion a year until 2030, and you'll hear more about this conference, about the detail of that. So there is going to be a 10-point plan. One of those points, you'll be, I'm sure, pleased to hear, is a nature plan. Nature will be significantly invested in by the next Labour government. We'll meet the challenge of the climate and nature emergency head on, creating good jobs for communities and providing leadership to seize opportunities for the UK in the process, including jobs in nature, jobs now that are without funding, and if we're right about the elms, that are going to be completely abandoned in terms of funding terms. I don't want our environment to be deregulated. Unlike Liz Truss, I want natural england to have more resources and more power. I want targets on species decline, woodland and soil set into law, and that they are tested independently. Independently, me and Minister, I want to be tested in government, that I'm meeting the targets that are set, and want them monitored independently and scrutinised, whether by the EAC, whether by independent regulators. That's detail for the manifesto. I want to see investment in additional protections nature really needs. That means creating more habitat for nature and making sure protected habitats are well managed. It means tackling pollution, climate change, and inappropriate development. I also think that nature is about people. And I want everybody in the UK to have access to nature in 10 minutes walk of their front door. And that means restoring nature and opening up land that is unavailable to people currently. 3 years ago, Labour forced the UK Parliament to be the first in the world to declare the climate and nature emergency. We'll be a leading voice at COP15 in Montreal, challenging other countries and highlighting nature-based solutions which serve social justice. I'm going to be here tomorrow again to talk about oceans. I won't talk too much today about the sad and catastrophic negotiation collapse that happened at the UN Oceans Conference, which the UK, I have to say, played a dismal role in, considering what happened. What we've seen actually is a gradual erosion within successive Tory governments' support. I'll be kind about somebody in the previous, he's in the government now, and that's Zach Goldsmith. Zach Goldsmith was committed to this agenda. There are people in this room I know who work closely with Zach Goldsmith. He was a minority voice, but when he was moved or replaced, because he was leaving government, he said, and then he's now in the FCDO. But anyway, I don't really understand the internal machinations of the Truss government. But he said that the UK was one of the most nature depleted countries on the planet, and he was right. And he led work on the Blue Belt, and he led work on UK overseas territories, good work which we will continue. But that was effectively junked recently at the UN Oceans Conference. And what I don't want to see is that the same approach goes into COP15. COP15 is our last best chance for nature globally. And if we don't get a binding agreement there in the way that we got in Paris for climate, and we don't have a similar regime for targets, then we are going to see catastrophic collapse of and a tipping point in biodiversity. The sort of species loss Simon's talking about is going to roll. And actually, we in the UK will just be rolling with it. And all the great work that zoos and aquariums do with species won't be for very much if we lose all those species in the natural environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Now I have pleasure in introducing Emily Darlington, the Deputy Leader of Milton Keynes Council. I'm really delighted to hear because, again, I actually have done some work in Milton Keynes in the past, and what I always find interesting about Milton Keynes is actually it was a new town that had biodiversity principles built into it. It actually had active travel principles built into it. And then we allowed the concept of growth and the way we manage that place to really abandon any of that ambition. And what I know from Emily is that she's actually looking to reinstate that ambition of Milton Keynes being somewhere that actually biodiversity is at the core. So, Emily, let's hear what you're up to.
Yeah, thank you. So I want to talk to you today about why this agenda is important for Labour councils and why it is a vote winner for us as Labour. So Milton Keynes is our country's newest city. As you know, we just got city status, but we also have the ambition of being the greenest city. And for us, just like as David Attenborough describes, that it's two sides of the same coin. We have a really ambitious carbon cutting agenda, but we do not heal our environment without promoting biodiversity. And one of the most important ways of doing that is by empowering our communities. So I always date back to a really important quote from one of my heroes, Wangari Maathai, in Kenya, who many of you will know started the Seeds for Change program. And she says, you cannot protect the environment unless you empower people, you inform them, and you help them to understand these resources are their own and they must protect them. That for me has been at the core of everything we've done at the council. So the first thing we needed to do was just get people to understand that it is a privilege in Milton Keynes that you live less than 10 minutes from a park. And that is the way the city's been designed, and we protect that through our planning process. But too often, those spaces are completely cut. They're not left to the enjoyment of the wildlife, flora or fauna. In fact, they're managed for the potential in what people think the enjoyment of people is. And actually, we had to have a huge program of change. So we created over 500 people and organizations coming together to create a biodiversity strategy for Milton Keynes. The reason I wanted to do it that way, I would have written it exactly the way it probably ended up, was that everyone would feel ownership. So now when we're doing the rewilding on our grid roads and somebody complains, that council, they don't mow anymore. Actually, it's other people in the public saying, no, they're doing this for wildlife. And I've set some really important targets for us. I call it the 5 Bs. What we have to do has to meet the needs of bees, bugs, butterflies, birds, and bats, because they are some of the most vulnerable in our society. I know people really love the hedgehog, but I think actually your bees, bugs, butterflies, bats, and birds are the ones that will tell you how well you're managing that locally. And the reason for that is, a reason for getting people to understand that is for people to actually start noticing that they don't get bugs on their windshields, or when they're cycling, they're not eating bugs anymore. And that is a problem. They need to, and we need to put it in simplest terms like that. People need to realize if you're not seeing those birds coming into your back garden anymore, that is a real problem. And it is, once people are able to grasp that concept, they really care and they're a part of it, and they start thinking differently about what they're planting in their flower boxes in their back gardens. And we're providing that kind of information because everybody has a role to play. In Milton Keynes, we have a lot of public park space, about 40%, and we'll continue to do that as we grow. But 60% is in people's back gardens. It's in people's window boxes. It's in people's, sorry, it's in people's, it's in people's gift. Are you going to pave your driveway, or are you going to put stones? These are really important decisions. The other thing we've done is built into our planning system. So we decided to go on our own with a biodiversity SPD. I know it's technical language, but it's something that we can actively do as councils to make sure that that money is reinvested, not only on the site of the new development, because we do build a lot of houses in Milton Keynes, but actually that we're integrating that with our suburban urban drainage ponds. These sorts of things that create lovely environments actually in our estates also are really important for our wildlife and for the different types of plants that can develop. Finally, what I would like to say is, as a mum, my real calling was to get the kids involved. So we created an Eco Warriors program. And this is linked to Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. And this brings together biodiversity, carbon reduction, and others so that the kids can be called Eco Warriors. And we have, even during the pandemic, the year of the pandemic when most kids weren't going to school, we had over 4,000 school children still doing and becoming Eco Warriors. Because ultimately, we're all doing this for the next generation. And so my final message to you is that councils have a huge, huge role to play in this. Those microclimates, those micro forests that we're creating, all of those little things that we can do have huge effects. The final thing I would also say is that it is hugely electorally popular. Much, much easier to sell than some of the harder decisions we do have to make on climate change. But when you show they're coming hand in hand, actually, people actually who are traditional Tories love it. So Labour is leading on this agenda. The work that Alex has come to see what we've been doing in Milton Keynes. We really can, through our efforts on both climate change and nature, really create that environment, start to heal the earth through our biodiversity work, and actually win votes and win the next election. Thank you.
we seem to be having a very important thread running through this, the importance about empowering people and actually bringing communities with you. And I have to say, I'm going to nick your 5Bs. That is so good. Okay, last but not least, I'd like to introduce Joe Baker. Science and the work of the IPCC really got us into understanding why, and absolutely why, as local government, we had to tackle climate change. At times when we talk about scientific approaches or innovation, we tend to actually get digital, technical. It's always about the sort of the new design, rather than actually understanding how science can actually take us forward. So Joe, as an early career researcher, is, I hope, going to give us his perspective on maybe what science could do to accelerate us along the road to improving biodiversity.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Joe from the University of Birmingham, from the Quantum Hub for Sensing and Metrology. So I'm going to briefly cover how optics and the applications from optics can be used to help the environment and then aid nature recovery. And I'll give a couple of examples. So as Lisa says, there are areas of science and public policy that get, there are areas of science that get quite a lot of headlines. Optics tends not to be one of those. So what I mean by that is if we can exploit light to then make lots of real world applications that can then be used to have a huge impact on the environment and a huge impact on nature recovery. So I'll give you one example. So very recently, Dr. Michael Holinsky and Professor Kai Bongs from the University of Birmingham, hence why I've sort of name dropped them, have developed a very sensitive quantum gravity sensor using quantum optics. Now, this is very sensitive to changes in density. Now, why am I telling you this? Well, the fact it's sensitive to changes in density means that there is an application in monitoring the CO2 that's been stored in carbon stores and that's been sequestered. I think Alex mentioned we need to avoid a tipping point and not sit in a positive feedback loop. In order for that to happen, we're going to have to sequester carbon, and we need ways of monitoring that in an effective way, basically. Now, from this, as well as monitoring CO2, it's also hugely important and useful for geologists and geophysicists to build a map of the underground system of the underground system of the UK, of the Earth we sit on, and which is, I mean, you don't need this system to know that fracking is not effective in the UK, but like this really shows that fracking is not effective in the UK. And in the future, we're hopefully looking at, as part of the InstaQT network, so that's the international network of quantum gravity sensors, which is very new, but we're looking at trying to build a worldwide network that's not just going to include scientists, it's going to include people in the public sector, private sector, local representatives, so that as Lisa says, you can actually empower people in their local areas. It's not just a bunch of academics in a room. So you'll end up with a big network of gravity sensors. And then this big data set can be accessed by geophysicists, both in institutions, in government, and in the private sector. And then hopefully working with people in the ecology sector in biology, can be used to monitor and predict things like freshwater loss, flooding, droughts, compacted soil, etc., which of course will have a huge impact on nature recovery. And one more, just quickly, one more example, one classical physics example. Quantic is a company that develops a lot of quantum sensors. They've recently developed a single pixel camera. Now, if we want to monitor and check for leaks, particularly methane, because methane emits a wavelength that we can't really see, it's just outside of our wavelength, outside of our eyes' ability to see, we need an infrared camera. Infrared cameras with lots and lots of pixels, tens of millions of pixels, are very expensive. Quantic have developed a camera that uses a single pixel, which is cheap and reliable, and can therefore be used, can be rolled out to monitor and check for methane leaks. And potentially other gases as well, like check for hydrogen stores across the world. So yeah, I've sort of rushed that a little bit, but that's sort of two examples. But I guess just to summarise that, I agree 100% with everything everyone said in terms of how you need to include people in their own lived environment. You need to have the consent of the people around you. You need to build communities and empower people. But as part of that community, science and academics also need to play a key part. And in particular, the applications of optics are many. And if they're not used for, say, to improve the environment, then they will be used for, other reasons, basically. So, thank you.
Okay, so use optics for good, or if not, the fossil fuel merchants will be on their way. And again, I think a point, I said that, not you. I think a point that both Alex and Joe brought up came up in our earlier session, the actual importance of real-time monitoring, that it's no good having some sort of scorecard where you're going to set the score for 10 years' time and not actually check when you're going to actually reach that tipping point. So the more we can have real-time evaluation. And one of the things I think we've got a real interest in a hearing from the panelists is actually how we can increase citizens' participation in this debate by actually making data available to them and for them to actually understand how they can monitor and evaluate. Because again, Emily's point, people really do care. People have reconnected with nature, and what we need to do is give them the tools. So you've heard from all of us. Now it's over to you. Do we have any questions, thoughts, perspectives you'd like to bring forward? Okay, I've got one there and then one behind. So Matt, if we could have, please, the one. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My name's Jo Blackman. I'm a councillor in Redbridge and Cabinet Member for the Environment, and also work at Global Witness. Really interesting to hear the perspectives today from local and international as well. I had two quick questions, mainly for Alex, really, but in light of what Simon was saying about the Environment Act and that really important provision on international deforestation, we are slightly concerned, as one of the NGOs that work really closely on it, that we are at a crucial stage because we're waiting for the secondary regulations, which will determine A, the number of commodities it applies to, as well as the size of companies, along with a whole other host of issues. Should we be worried under the new government? And have you got any tips for us as a sector in terms of making sure it's as effective as possible? And my second question is in relation to the flows of financing. So we know the UK and the City of London source of huge amount of financing which goes towards destructive agribusiness, all sorts of really devastating environmental practices globally. Do you think the Labour front bench is in a position to back the calls for mandatory requirements on finance in the same way that we're seeing them on supply chains through the Environment Act? And there is an opportunity coming up with the Financial Services and Markets Bill, which I'm happy to pick up with you after as well, Alex.
Okay, I'll take the gentleman behind as well, and then we can get the responses to those points.
Hi, thanks very much. My question was just about the relationship with the National Farmers Union and food production and food security, and how Labour is looking to manage that relationship moving forward in the context of the move away from the Common Agricultural Payment Scheme, and with an emphasis on public good and environmentalism. Thank you.
Thank you for that point and the importance of common good. Okay, Alex, if you'd like to crack off first.
I just felt like all those questions were for me, which is normal because I'm the Shadow Minister. So I'll take Joe's first, and I'd also, Joe, come and see me in Parliament, so we can get into this a bit longer than a 2-minute answer now. So we're absolutely right to be concerned about the secondary legislation that's going to emanate from the Environment Act on deforestation. So our position is that actually we need to act both on deforestation, which is illegal in other territories, but also which is legal in other territories, particularly thinking, although hopefully it will change shortly, about the Brazilian government and the changes to deforestation in Brazil, meaning that some products which were previously illegal are now legal. And so when I said that we'll put a test, a nature test, that's you know, I was inferring, that's part of my inference. So we're going to take a very strong line on deforestation goods, and we are in committee as well. We will not be voting for that second legislation as it stands. It hasn't been published yet, but if it is as we are expect it to be, if the government hugely strengthen it, although I'll be shocked considering what's come out in the last 48 hours, that it will be strengthened. In terms of flows of financing around agribusiness, there is the task force for nature-related financial disclosures, and we are, you know, working with meeting with the task force, and definitely looking, because we feel that they have the expertise, but clearly there are people in the NGO sector have expertise as well in that area. And it is, to be honest, the final decision on that doesn't rest in DEFRA and the Shadow DEFRA team. It rests in the Shadow International Trade team. So we are talking to Nick Thomas-Simmons and his team about this. And we will be making our views known to them. But I would say, yeah, meet us about it, but meet Nick and his team, because they're going to have the final say on this area. But as I say, we'll definitely try and take a lead from that task force. In terms of the NFU, so this actually originally, I'm not sure I meant to say this, Matt will probably kill me, this fringe originally was meant to be Daniel Zeitner speaking, not me, and Daniel is the Shadow Minister for Farming and Fisheries, and he's got the lead relationship with the NFU, but obviously I do have a relationship with the NFU as well. And in terms of, you know, the cap basic payment and what looks like potentially a continuation of that or movement to elms, there is very clearly a big split in the farming community. So, you know, so for instance, the Future Farmers or the Nature Friendly Farming Network are very supportive of the move, while there are farmers, may I say, the current minister might be in that space, who are not so in favour of that move, and maybe that's why we're having these press reports. We're very committed to a nature-based approach. We do not want to see a continuation of basic payments. What we've said previously, which I know has been a topic of discussion in the NGO sector, maybe this is what you were alluding to in the question, I don't know if it was, is what we don't want to see is effectively a period with no payments. So that we were looking at a gap, but that now with the change of government, that's not really change of government, change of leadership and change of ministers, doesn't look like that's the issue anymore. You know, ripped up that book of worries and have a whole new book of worries, and it looks like a complete abandonment of elms and a nature-based approach. So that's probably where we are now. I think that covers it. Yeah.
I think that was fairly covered. Simon?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm really pleased to hear you say, Alex, that you support the strengthening of the proposed legislation on due diligence with regard to deforestation risk commodities. That's something we've been pushing for too, in terms of not just relying on illegal sources of deforestation, but also legal too. I would just make a plea to consider certification schemes. They are in their infancy. Sustainable palm oil, or palm oil, is probably the furthest along the way with the RSPO, the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. And I will admit it's not perfect, but it is encouraging sustainability in production. It's encouraging smallholders. It's encouraging better treatment of workers, improvements to reforestation around the plantations. Some really great initiatives out of that. So I would like to see that built into the legislation. Obviously, it's not available for most commodities, but where it is, to encourage others to come on board. On the farming point, I'd just like to say that, yeah, I'm extremely worried about what we've heard over the last 24 hours, and obviously be following it closely. I think it's worth pointing out that as well as elms, the government has got a commitment to a nature recovery network for the whole country, actually, certainly the whole of England. And that'll be manifested locally with regional, local nature recovery strategies. We're involved in ours in Cheshire. I'm sure many people in this room are involved in their local ones. And that cannot be delivered without a better system of supporting farmers to encourage environmental improvements on their land. It has to be strategic. So I cannot see how, if they do drop ELMS, how they're going to then meet commitments on nature recovery. So that's another thing I think politicians need to get together about and really look at it strategically. Thank you.
Thank you for that. We've got time for a couple more points. Other points? Gentleman there and the woman at the back.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm a delegate from the Battersea CLP and a newly elected councillor in Wandsworth. I wanted to ask about measures to improve biodiversity in cities which are densely populated. Like one that I'm a particular fan of are green roofs, because not everyone has the room to build more biodiversity into their back or front gardens, and so the idea of putting on the roofs and also making it, a nice. There's a myriad of benefits for it. So I was wondering if there are going to be any steps in manifesto commitments for improving the uptake of these, and if you wanted to list any other sort of biodiversity measures for cities as well, that'd be great. Thanks.
Okay, and can I take I'll take yours and
Thank you. Hi, Nicola Beach from Bristol East. My question is about ash dieback, and I just wondered if Labour had a position on that nationally in terms of financing that in the next administration. Thanks.
Okay, I think I'd like to go to Emily to respond to the first point about cities and what could be done there. And then Alex, if you'd like to follow up on the Labour policy point, and obviously my two colleagues, if there's anything else.
So there's a couple of more things. In terms of cities, I'm a huge fan of CEDAM. They are not only amazing carbon capture and are not only amazing for carbon, but they're also amazing for biodiversity. We've put them on top of all our bus shelters, call them buzz stops because they do attract bees. Because we like catchy names in Milton Keynes. But also, as we are doing a huge amount of green roofs right across our city centre. But when I would just say one thing, a word of caution about thinking about green roofs. Don't forget also that they are amazing places for bees and others. So do create that infrastructure. Also, some of the things that we're doing with some of our new taller buildings going into the city centre is making sure they have those perch points that nests can be built to attract the red kites into the city centre to deal with some of the pigeon issues, but actually to bring some of that back in. So there's a whole bunch of things that you can do at different levels, including living walls. I mean, nothing creates a nicer environment than having a living wall. Brilliant for biodiversity, particularly if it's flowering, but actually what you're creating is a much nicer feel within your city centre. So there's so many things that you can do at different levels. Using your biodiversity SPD through your planning, you will get money from any new things that you can invest into these kinds of projects. So if you want to have a chat about other things you can do in your council, I'd be more than happy to. And the thing is about finding the right things in the right place that are creative for your own city, that will be loved and nurtured by your residents.
And also there is an argument in terms of maintenance, upkeep, that actually when you're looking at making efficiencies, or dare I say, it's going to be, we're facing massive cuts potentially, actually investing in biodiversity is a saver. Alex?
Thank you. I think it's probably worth saying, because both of those questions asked about the manifesto. I think if you think about the manifesto like a painting, and that we're currently at the pencil sketch phase, so you can see an outline of what the manifesto might look like, but there isn't a manifesto. It's not just waiting to be printed. So we're still at that sort of phase of it. So I can't give you a load of manifesto commitments here, not because I'm hiding them, but because we're still working them through. But what I can say, and Simon, I probably should have said this earlier, but Simon's point about nature recovery networks, both at a national scale and local scale, that is something that we're going to build on in the manifesto and as a government. And, you know, currently nature recovery networks are, I think it's fair to say, not brilliantly funded. You don't probably turn up and think this is the world's best funded scheme. But we see them as a vehicle to build green jobs, to build skills, to build nature recovery. And those networks, so London isn't a rural area, as we know. I'm also, in Leeds as well. We're a major urban conurbation, 800,000 people, although there are rural parts of it. Those are both areas of nature recovery networks, local nature recovery networks. Those local nature recovery networks will be supported just the same as ones in very rural areas. And the idea is that we'll do things that are appropriate to the landscape as it is. And so in urban areas like ours, we will think about green roofs, a good example, wild verges, which again, Emily talked about. We'll look at some of the other urban infrastructure. Blue-green as well is really important, so looking at our waterways, and that feeds into the whole, my other bit of my portfolio in flooding, because that creates flood resistance. We'll look at investing in SUDs as well, because that again helps us with the sewage issue, which I think everybody here might have noticed has become top, not quite top of the news headlines. I think energy was above it, but right up there as a major issue for people. So we view this in a very rounded way. We're not going to say bonfire regulations going for growth. What we're saying is we need to make people's lives better on the ground, and nature provides part of that solution, even if people don't particularly believe or support nature. But it's about creating, in particularly in urban areas, the environment for people and an environment for better lives for them. In terms of tree blight more generally, actually, ash dieback currently is the worst case scenario. But I went to the Powderham estate in March or April, and the first case of beech blight in the UK was found on that estate the previous year. We are seeing more and more tree diseases in different species, and it's been driven by climate change, also a little bit by invasive species and all of that, and our borders not being as tightly controlled as, say, the borders of New Zealand, who are very strong on biocontrol. If you ever looked at their regs, and I'm in contact with their Minister of Conservation, they have a Labour government though, unlike us, and so they're clearly getting it right. And what we'd look at is one, looking at biosecurity. So we didn't have more ash diebacks. That will be a very strong part of our work, but also in terms of our nature restoration strategy to ensure we support the ash we've got left and try and retain it, but also in terms of restoring trees, utilising indigenous species, not having, we have in the past, unfortunately, brought in foreign tree species and had large-scale forestry, things that just weren't appropriate on land, and so we're working closely with Woodland Trust now to talk about that. And so hopefully by the time we get to the manifesto, we'll have something that's in keeping and supporting. So we want to build in resilience. So it's one thing to try and create a solution for what's happening today, and quite another thing to build resilience for the future. And that's our aim, is to build resilience in our tree population for the future.
Simon?
Thank you. Yeah, just a few words on both of those. Fantastic to hear the work you're doing, Emily, in Milton Keynes. I mean, I was going to say, this is where local government comes into its own, and regional government. I mean, we're working with our own local authority in Cheshire West and Chester on a nature recovery project, and on the wider wildlife connections, very similar sort of thing. But what you were exemplifying there, I thought was brilliant, and obviously some great things going on in London too. There is a proposal from some of the wildlife trusts around city national parks, which is really interesting. We're discussing it locally at the moment. And it comes back to nature recovery networks and connections. That isn't just for the countryside, it's everywhere. And there's a huge amount that can be done to connect up habitats in urban areas and improve green spaces for wildlife. And on ash dieback, funnily enough, we have a PhD student studying this with us at Chester Zoo. So we don't only work on animals, we work on plants. We're interested in saving biodiversity of plants. And obviously, it's a plea for science, and maybe chance for Joe to come in, because we need the good science to solve these problems for us.
Joe, do you want to say anything about good science, bad science? I know the colleague there wants to know the name of the PhD student who's got specialising in Ash Diver. We will definitely make the connection. Are there any final points? There was a gentleman at the back.
It's just about, so I'm Marvin Rees, Mayor of Bristol. So
Sorry, Marvin, I should have.
that's all right. I'm not expecting anything
I
special.
wondered why Ken was going.
All right. So it's just about how we frame taking on the kind of competing challenges of our country at the moment. So if I just put it close to you, Bristol's 470,000 people today, 17,000 people on the housing waiting list, 1,000 families in temporary accommodation, 1 in 4 kids in poverty. We're going to be 550,000 people by the middle of this century. We've got 42 square miles. We're not getting any more land. So, you know, we have to build homes. But the quality of debate in the city is quite poor, somewhat driven by environmentalism, actually, which doesn't want to own the consequences of not building homes, but actually advocates for building homes, but won't advocate for building at higher density on brownfield sites, while also, you know, arguing against building on new plots of land that we're trying to protect for nature. So I'm just wondering how if you have a framework for talking about urbanization, meeting our housing crisis and that competition for land. I love what you talked about, perch points on tall buildings, because we are looking at height and density, because that's the way we see taking that challenge on. But how you're framing that debate about meeting the needs of growing urban, well, a national population, but urban populations as well.
Okay, we'll take final point here, and I'd certainly love to pick up, Marvin, with you about that after, because again, it's one of those challenges about higher density and people then, some builders still insisting on certain specs that don't actually fit with what the urban environment in the future requires. Alice.
Thank you. My question, you've talked a lot about different habitats, and obviously there's the ocean talk tomorrow, but one of the things that's not often talked about as much is the inland waterways, particularly canals, rivers, and those can be like points where people really get to connect with nature, whether it's through walking through them or even swimming. And one thing I've noticed, particularly this year, and I don't know if there's any studies because I'm not very sciencey, but anecdotally is there's been a lot more algae plumes and a lot more blue-green algae plumes across the country. And yeah, it's just, I know part of that's caused by, from just GCSE science, part of that's caused by fertilizer. But what can be done to bring back the waterways and particularly the inland waterways?
Okay, right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Emily first. I'm going to give Joe a chance if he's got any bright thoughts from where he can, science could contribute, and then any final remarks from my colleagues.
So I'll just pick up your points first. So in Milton Keynes, our green and blue infrastructure is extremely vital. One of the reasons it's vital, we have a canal, we have a river, and we flood. And so if we don't consider that blue infrastructure alongside our green infrastructure, it actually damages people's homes, livelihoods, and others. So for us, they are, when we talk about our green infrastructure, we do mean our green and blue infrastructure, and it's something we take very, very seriously. Picking up, I'll let the scientist pick up the blue algae point, or Alex, but we have similar issues, and actually people want to connect, they want to swim, they want to do open water swimming for its benefits for dementia and many other things. We've seen a rise in that, so we are definitely looking at how we facilitate that, and we're creating a new country park in the south that will have available open water swimming. But of course our real fear is the blue algae problem, which has led to many of our flood defenses and others being to fishing and other things that we would normally have. Picking up Marvin's point, so we're about 100,000 people behind Marvin, but we have the exact same similar issues in Milton Keynes. But what we were blessed with was a master plan that included linear parks, had a commitment that 40% of developed space would be actually green and blue infrastructure. So our linear parks take us right through, connect various larger wildlife areas, but they are also managed by the Parks Trust on our behalf, so that those paths can be enjoyed, that with paths and others that can be enjoyed throughout. The way we deal with it in Milton Keynes is partly, you know, this is about what Milton Keynes is about. If you're moving to Milton Keynes, we are about having a good quality of life, that you do have access to nature. And that's one of the many reasons people move to our area, not least the location, schools and others. But actually, the pandemic showed us how important that was to people's mental health. And we saw people really reconnecting with those parks and others. We will always build houses in Milton Keynes. We have very ambitious, we'll be up to almost 500,000 by the middle of the century.
You need another MP.
Well, we're probably one of the few places with the boundary reviews that we're actually getting more MPs than rather than less, because exactly those reasons. But we say part of that agreement is that 40% remains. No matter how much bigger we get, 40% is that green and blue infrastructure. We continue to protect it. And we're pushing our developers through our biodiversity SPD to do some of the really easy stuff like bee bricks and holes in fences for hedgehogs and all of those sorts of things. But we're also pushing them to think about, using SUDs, as part of our flood defenses, but actually as part of our biodiversity strategy. Doesn't mean that we don't get people saying, oh, what we need to do is we need to stop building houses. But we do have the majority of the people on side, because we're saying the houses that we're building is not about destroying your parks. It's about creating more parks as we create more estates. Now, that's an advantage of being in Milton Keynes. I appreciate Bristol is a little more landlocked than we are at the moment, but hopefully that's a little bit helpful. Oh, sorry.
I could ask if you want to do just really tiny little snippets, so we can wrap up on time.
So I'll only talk about the bit I know about then. So very briefly, how can optics help with water pollution, particularly non-water pollution? So there's a number of ways. I'll leave Simon to explain how we can actually recover areas that have been poisoned or lost. But there's an area of optics called fluorescence multisensors. So you take a molecule that fluoresces, basically, and you make a sensor based on that. And that's very specific, and that's got a big tolerance to temperature and all sorts of changes in acidity and all sorts of things. But because it's so specific, you can have, in a certain area, we can say to a biologist, okay, is there something here that's particularly susceptible to a chemical, to a pollutant, to a metal ion? And then some very smart chemist will tailor that fluorophore, that fluorescent molecule, to that, which then means we get very, very high sensitivity. And we'd say below 1 nanogram per liter in terms of like the amount of content in the water. So
That is super clever.
Okay, my much less sciencey response is we are getting more algae, and that's because of, you're right, phosphorus runoff, so more phosphorus through phosphates in the water, but also because of climate change, it's getting warmer. So algae doesn't appear in colder temperatures, even though the governments sometimes think it does, but in warmer temperatures. So that's the problem. And the solution, obviously, is to tackle climate change, but actually much more precipitously is we need farmers to change their behaviour. So utilisation of cover crops, less chemicals, etc., but also one of the things that Elms does, and will, if it was to continue, is to leave bands of land at the edge of fields, 1 to 2 metre bands, where they don't utilise chemicals, which is left to nature, and that creates a barrier for chemical runoff. So then there'll be less algae, less issues around water quality and a whole range of other things. And, but again, if elms are cut off, we go back to basic payments, they'll farm right to the edge of their land because that's what they're being encouraged to do.
Yeah, okay, I think we're moving on to the closing remarks now. So I just want to make a couple of points. It's been a really interesting discussion, and thank you ever so much for inviting me to be on the panel. I think, we've heard the scale of the challenge today, and I think we're all well aware of that. But we've also heard that we've got some of the solutions. All of us, I think, were talking about solutions. And a lot of that solution is about empowering people. Actually, it's about everybody participating. We've heard some brilliant examples of that too. And I would just make a final plea, particularly to politicians and people in the political sphere, to make nature part of the discussion about these things. We had a mini budget, I don't know what I meant to call it, on Friday, without any mention of nature. And actually, too often you hear discussion of important issues, even economic growth. We should still be framing it around nature. Nature is essential to economic growth, is integral to economic growth. So we really do need to mainstream nature. Even when we talk about climate change, we don't talk enough about nature. So I would make a final plea to politicians to do that.
Okay, and thank you for all of those comments, colleagues. And again, I think what we come back to is this importance about participation, public participation, and actually challenging the current orthodoxy. Because again, as somebody from a strong urban area with massive housing need, actually what we need to start looking at is how do we actually aspire to build those sustainable communities that are fit for today's generation and the future. And that actually means about us negotiating and reconciling all of our needs and requirements. And I hope very much today is the start of the debate. I'd like to thank the panelists very much. I'd like to thank Chester Zoo. I'd like to thank Alex for winging it on behalf of Daniel. And I'd very much like to thank all of you who actually turned up today. Without your participation, Fringe events would be very small. So thank you very much, and thank you for your contribution.